This is Las Doctoras podcast with your favorite profas, Dr. Renee Limas
and Doctora Cristina Rose. Join us as we bring women and gender studies topics out of the university and onto the kitchen table.
Salud! Hello.
Buen dia.
Welcome to Las Doctoras podcast. I don't know what episode this is.
Back in the swing of our
we are in our sixth season.
Sorry.
Excited. Did you say fifth?
I did. Today's our anniversary.
Oh, it is our anniversary of the podcast when we're recording it. So we're happy to be here again, and we're happy to have on our wonderful guest that we're gonna ask to introduce herself. And
bienvenidos, Atava. Honored to have you here in our space.
So if you'd love to just share with us your name, pronouns, any astrology you want to share, any of your ancestry you want to share with us,
and your medicina.
Mm-hmm. Great, that's a long list. So hopefully I'll cover
I know, you don't have to do it all.
My name is Atava Garcia Swiecicki. Based on my name, I identify as mixed race culture from actually ancestors from Mexico. New Mexico also have some ancestry from northern New Mexico, and also Eastern Europe, mainly Poland and Hungary. Let's see, pronouns, she, her, ella. I always like to say too, this has become something I've shared a lot, is that I was born and conceived in what is now called Detroit, Anishinaabe and Wyandot land, and where all of my grandparents immigrated in the early 1900s as part of the auto industry. So that's where my parents met, where I was born and lived as just a young child. My family moved around a lot, but I spent most of my adult life in Northern California, primarily in Ohlone territory in Oakland, California. And I always like to say that too, because I really feel like so much of my biography is really informed by place and the people of the place, the community that shaped me. So my medicina, I'll say that. So I like to identify as an herbalist, and that's a conversation we can talk about too, like who calls themselves a curandera, short thing. It's a name our community gives to us. But, within that umbrella of a practitioner of Curanderismo, I'm really an herbalist. Been studying that. Actually, next year will be 30 years since I really met my first teacher and got on that road of working with plants as physical medicine, as emotional, spiritual medicine for myself, teaching and training others. I've trained hundreds and hundreds of students, and then also seen clients. And astrology, Leo sun, Virgo rising, Capricorn moon. And I just this year turned 55. So, in our Mexica traditions, like I'm a baby elder. I like to say that too. Like I'm learning how to be an elder, like from my elders who are in their later 60s or 70s or 80s. But I do feel like I've crossed to a new threshold in terms of where I'm in life.
I love that.
Yeah. That's I mean, I say that as well. I was like, we're closer to that than we are to the other side. But yeah, welcome. Thank you for being here. And I think we would,
I just want to recognize that, I am one of your students. And I'm just so grateful for the time that we spent together in Alhambra, I think. I was trying to remember where Maria lived at the time, and I was pregnant, and because of our time together, Jaguar has his name, and so much more, and honestly, the friendships that I have from there with Kelly, with Faye, like Maria, with you, are so long lasting. It's so beautiful. I'm so grateful for you as a mentor and a maestra, and thank you so much for being here with us too.
You're welcome. It's good to, be back in space with you and to meet your comadre.
And
I love that you're doing. It's really important. I think, these conversations, at least the podcasts I've listened to, are important conversations. And as we all evolve on this path of growth and evolution and healing and remembering and decolonizing, like I think so many conversations I'm always learning, and we learn by being in conversation. So.
Yeah. So I think maybe we would love to hear just a little bit about your journey. I think it's we've talked a lot about our journey and all the ups and downs and what leads us to where we're at, and it's in that journey that we find our own path toward healing, and then where our work as healers extends from. And so we would love to just hear a little bit about your journey and what's brought you to your medicina.
Definitely. So, unlike a lot of my friends or students, like I didn't grow up with really explicit like curanderismo in my household, or really any ancestral medicine practice in my family. Like again, I have friends who their grandmother rubbed them with a huevo or did a limpia. Like I think because of to the age of my parents, when they came of age, it was a lot of assimilation, times of assimilation. And I always like to think that like all my grandparents had a different first language than English. My parents just learned English. I just learned English. And that also relates to like culture and tradition. However, the really strong practice that was maintained in my family, as I look back with different eyes, the eyes of an older person, is actually both my parents always tended to the earth. They always had a garden. I mean, and so that was a model that I know came from their parents and on and on. I'm kind of claiming that as that's actually really important teaching. Although at the time, you just think your dad's growing vegetables, your mom's growing flowers and herbs, but I didn't think anything of it. So I do want to say, I'm pretty sure all of my ancestors were farmers. And the ones that I know from Mexico were, I'm pretty sure my Polish ones were, pretty sure the ones from New Mexico were, because that's how this community was for hundreds of years. But so I was in college in the 80s, and I look back at myself as really searching for, first of all, healing for myself. Like in the 80s, in the collective, there wasn't language about trauma, about intergenerational trauma, about childhood trauma, about addiction, about mental health. There's nothing. And I grew up in a family with addiction, with my father being a gambling, addicted to gambling. So I had a lot of whatever in wounding, trauma, little to big T, and in my life, as a teen. And I just remember being at college and just feeling like I was searching. I think I went to college too young, but anyways, I was searching, in academia for something that would help me understand my own life and my own, and it didn't exist except for and I'm really grateful, in the very new feminist studies program. I became a major before it even existed. So again, in the 80s, feminist studies, or women, LGBTQ was just starting. All the ethnic studies were just starting. It wasn't just a given that you were at a college, you'd have that. So I'm grateful, because then I was, reading like This Bridge Called My Back and Audre Lorde. And it's like a very, I feel like actually the lesbian feminists and the women of color feminists just informed my little young consciousness. So I didn't find what I was looking for, in terms of healing until, after college. That's how sometimes it goes. And I was literally invited by my sister to a herbal gathering. And this was, 1994, which is why I know it's the anniversary, and 30-year anniversary for me. And just when I stepped onto this land, and all these women and children were like making medicine and tinctures, and I was like, this is it. Like, again, I hadn't seen that in my life before. It wasn't modeled to me, but I was like, I want to like learn how to make potions with plants, and I want to like do all of that magic. So I met my first herbal teacher there, Karen Sanders, who's Choctaw and Jewish. And I was really grateful for, she has this show called The Herbal Highway on KPFA for, again, over 30 years. I was really grateful for her because my first teacher was a woman of color. She was also is queer and also taught from an indigenous perspective, which isn't really represented in the herbal world and the quote American herbal world. So as I started studying with her, I just became really curious, like about what was my own ancestral medicine practices. And again, now we're in the 90s, pre-internet. I maybe just like only select people. I didn't have an email until 2000. So that's how I always
Same.
my life. So
98.
So I was just
college,
like, well, what did my ancestors
mm-hmm.
do? I was really close to going to acupuncture school for traditional Chinese medicine. I was like, you know, I really respect that system of healing, but I just had that curiosity. Like I knew like plant medicine was my jam. I just got excited about it. It is, I'm still excited about it. And I'm still learning. It's a lifelong, never ending learning about plant medicine, but yeah, so I just had that curiosity and I guess a prayer in my heart. And I was working at an herbal store in San Francisco, and in walked Doña Enriqueta Contreras. And I don't know if either of you met her, but she's like she's a force of nature. She's a curandera, a Zapotec curandera from Oaxaca. And at that point, she was traveling back and forth to the quote US quite a bit. So she walked in the store and I was just like, who is she? You know, it was very an intuitive, like a magnetic draw to her, like attraction. Like I just want to like, you know, be around her. So yeah, so that became my journey of studying with her, taking classes with her. And I continued to study herbalism from, you know, other, like what's represented a lot in, again, quote, American herbal schools is very Western, Eurocentric, very disconnected from cultural lineages, a lot of cultural appropriation, all of that. So, and it just kind of makes sense that, you know, it was Mexican curandera walked in being in California, as opposed to like a Polish healer. I'm actually now doing more work with my Polish ancestors than I have, but, you know, Doña Enriqueta showed up first, and through her I met Estela Roman and really just began that journey of learning. And you know, through all of this too, it really was first and foremost about really learning how to tend to my own self, like to that, and also traditional therapy, but I've never had super traditional. It's been more and more of art or visualization or dream work, but to really work with, you know, the childhood and, you know, early life issues that are trauma or, you know, all of that. So that really became my focus. And as I continued to learn and continued to study herbalism, I also realized that, again, what was represented in a lot of herbal educational spaces, it's kind of blew my mind, like in California, whatever, it's Latinx majority practically, right? That you could have like a zillion traditional Chinese medicine schools and all these acupuncturists, but there's like no info or awareness or understanding of like what comes from Mexico, which of course California was Mexico, or, you know, the US Southwest and all of that. So I just became very interested to like learn and also educate, because what I've learned is like it's a really sophisticated system of healing. And we can talk about, you know, what curanderismo is, but if it hadn't been for the Spanish or whatever invasion, colonization, like a lot of these traditions would not have been broken and would be as esteemed as like Ayurveda or traditional Chinese medicine. So, you know, within that, I guess I would also say, I really believe, I didn't know this was, I didn't know healing justice was a word until that incredible book, Healing Justice Lineages. But it's like, oh, I've been doing that. Like, I really think, again, Western medicine is good for emergencies. It's good for crisis. It's good for serious diagnoses, but it leaves so many people, well, either don't have access to that, or else one thing happens, but then there's so many holes in like what the care they get. So, and I really feel like herbalism, and then a lot of the practices of curanderismo, when people learn them, they're actually empowered to take care of a lot of their own healthcare needs. And that's really important for our communities to be more resilient, to be able to have people who know, like, okay, this, you know, like when COVID happened or whatever's happening, it's like we can freak out and but like, okay, let's turn to the plants. Like I already have a relationship with like yarrow or elderberry or echinacea or garlic or cilantro, whatever the plant is. So it's so that it's so I really feel like for me, there's always been an activism element to my work, because we can't, you know, that's my critique. I'm sure you have it too, of the quote self-help movement and all that. It's like, great. So like people with privilege can pay thousands of dollars to just better. And then there's a lot of gatekeeping. So I feel like herbalism can be very accessible and very, so, you know, that's why as I trained my students, I saw every student would go and then to their community and kind of spread the word, you know, bring plants, you know, teach people how to make fire cider, elderberry cordial. Anyways, I'm going on and on, but
so but that's the story is just magical, really.
Yeah.
And organic. And from
a lot of my work has been teaching. A lot has been seeing clients, but also a lot of work on myself. And, you know, I've since the last time I saw you, I've just had a series of health crises. And so I really had to kind of retract from like giving and actually put a lot of that energy into my own self. And experience the medicine, like what it's like to, and so the biggest thing was 5 years ago, I was diagnosed with uterine cancer. And I know the doctor like took out the cancer, or the surgeon, but it was really the medicina, the prayers, the limpias, the body work, the food, that actually healed me. I feel like I'm still in process from that, because it was really big susto of the full healing, but I got to experience like going through a very scary health issue with this huge cushion of support from the plantitas, from my community. So I think I'd be a really different person going through that without that, you know. I don't know if I'd still be here on this planet, you know, who knows. So I'm really committed to, again, like to teaching people, to sharing information so that people can build their own toolkit, thus the Curanderx toolkit, which was a class and now is a book, so that people have these, you know, have access. Because I feel like everything should be accessible, you know, and of course we're all trying to exist in capitalism, but I know we'll have that conversation. But with a book, like when Cristina, I met you, I was mostly teaching in Oakland and was invited by Felicia to come to LA. So I was teaching there, but you know, those are still bubbles. Those are both bubbles now. And they're bubbles of like, we know whatever, ancestral medicine, of all of that, of just access to all kinds of healing, and also just the kind of consciousness. But when you leave that bubble, what I've noticed now, and as my book has brought me to different places, and I also get people from all around the world actually in my classes, is that people are searching for just knowledge that, especially the Latinx folks, we want to connect with ancestral medicine, but everyone wants to connect with ancestral medicine. You know, it's not just that, but they're also searching for community. And that's kind of my vision now, is that we actually change the culture to be like a culture of community care, culture of having these skills. Because we can't wait for the government to change the culture, but we can change it. And I really believe it's building community of whatever we call ourselves. healers, whatever, curanderas, people just of the heart. I don't know the language, but just people, trying to walk a path and do some of the trauma of the legacy and continuing trauma, right? The continuing genocide that's happening and on Earth right now in places like Palestine. So. So I will end there and see if you have the question.
I mean, I hope you feel from us. There's just so much beautiful resonance, like gratitude. As you speak your story, we're like, yes, that book. Yes, that moment.
Knowing that our journey is very similar, right? The idea of like searching for I think validation a lot of times, and also having that moment in our women's studies, in our Chicano studies classes, and like, oh yes, this is where it helps us make sense of our own experience. I love when you talk about healing justice. First of all, I love that. So I'm currently teaching a class on reproductive justice. And so we're talking a lot about like, what is reproductive justice and what does that mean? And we, interestingly enough, we were recently talking about abortion, and we were kind of trying to look at it, all the different nuances, both in terms politically, right? Like what is happening politically with abortion, but then also how we have to sort of make that there's a bigger conversation around accessibility, right? Which is what you spoke to, right? And which is something we always talk about with our podcast too, right? Because we were also drawn to academia because it was one of the only spaces that we could do this work. And then there's so much gatekeeping that happens in academia. So we're like, how do we create something that makes a lot of this language, this knowledge accessible to a wider audience? So anyway, we talked a lot about in my class around abortion and how the need for community care versus the medical industrial complex, right? And the ways that you're speaking to, right? Where does Western medicine, right, and ancestral medicine come together? And I so much empathy for your experience, right, with uterine cancer, and knowing that, yes, the doctor was able to provide a certain level of medical care, but that doesn't meet the aftercare, the emotional care, the spiritual care that it truly requires to heal. And so that's kind of the thing that I've opened up in terms of the conversation around abortion, right? Is like, okay, access, legality, and access to the procedure is one thing, but what about like the aftercare, the community care, right? Around that. And so I think that, again, we're just immersed in all of these kinds of conversations and recognize what ancestral medicine has helped us to do and helped us to understand, and absolutely always having that that lens of justice and activism as we're doing any work that we do, really. So I love the way that you bring all of those conversations together.
Yeah, for me, growing up in a pretty assimilationist kind of home too, that's a big word for that, but I love you speaking to the ways in which those traditions endured. And then through your own healing journey, the language, there's just so much in that came back. So then you can integrate everything together instead of disassociating or, separating yourself from assimilation. It's like you are all of these things. And I think that's big for me. And I think the thing that community brings to me, just like you are in this moment, are these reminders, maybe particularly because I grew up in such a home that was almost anti, indigeneity, anti, not almost, was, I can say. I need those reminders. Like right now when you were speaking to Susto, I was just thinking like, oh, that's what's happening for me right now. And I appreciate that. And I need that from
to be able
my
to
communal
name
spaces.
That. We at the beginning of the pandemic read, we created a book club and we read Women Who Glows in the Dark, where it goes through all these different types of ailments, right? And we're not talking necessarily physical things, but these spiritual sort of ailments, or these holistic, and yeah, things like susto was like, oh yeah, well, of course we're all dealing with susto, because we're scared, as we're scared of what's happening. And I mean, I think we're probably in a moment like that right now, given what is going on, is that there's a lot of fear. And how do we ground ourselves even in these moments, where there is collective trauma happening right now, right? Like, where do we find the healing? And yeah, we've always turned to that, to ancestral medicine for those kinds of things. My lineage, my great grandmother, so very Catholic. My family is very, very Catholic, but I also had a great grandmother who, aside from being super Catholic, was also like reading tarot cards. And so for my family, there's always been this kind of amalgamation of these practices. My mom is also very much, some might call her a crazy plant lady. She's just always been into plants, and and has a really, I think, deep connection to them. She always says that that they, if they feel neglected, she's like, they'll tell me when they feel neglected, or they'll, it's very interesting. And I'm trying to do that, because I've never, that's not always my medicine, but anyway. But I also wanted to come back to something that you mentioned about, like, even defining curanderismo, because, and something we talked about even prior to getting, to recording, is, yeah, there is this influx of people doing work in, spiritual work and ancestral medicine. And, we've often had the conversation of how do those things get exploited? And then how do we, as somebody, as those of us are who are in search of something, it's like, how do we decipher, right? What's what is truly connected, and what is being culturally appropriated, right? Because I think there's just so much, there's a saturation of, like you said, content out there, and it's like, what content is really grounded and rooted, in something, and what is actually rooted in capitalism.
I love that we can say that. Like I said, it's like, yes, and yes, we need more. It's just like the same thing with like media that represents us. We can critique it, but yes, and we need more of it. I love how you spoke to like how it should be as prevalent as Ayurvedic practices or acupuncture practice. Like, this medicine should be there, and we know. I think we have a good lens when it comes to Ayurvedic, or different practices like that. What's real and what's like, been appropriated.
Yeah,
and I think we need those skills when it comes to our people's medicine too.
Yeah, so I'd love for you to maybe speak to, what is curanderismo? What does that mean, and how has that maybe evolved even over time?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one I had to think about a lot and read about and talk to a lot of my peers and my elders, because once you write something in a book, you can't be like, I take that back. So I wanted to I really feel like, well, first of all, it's a modern term, and it may have been coined actually by Dr. Cheo Torres, who's here at University of New Mexico, Albuquerque, who is one of the founders, along with Elena Avila, of the 2-week Curanderismo class that happens, I think it's been going on about 25 years, but every summer through the university. So he said when they were first organizing, they wanted to have a class that just talked about, quote, the traditional medicine, the remedios, the limpias, all the teas, all of that very much exists here in New Mexico. The, quote, Southwest, and really all throughout, quote, the Americas, in different shapes or forms that are definitely from like what's now the Southwest down through South America. So he's like, well, he's like, what will I call it? Because we can't just call it like the traditional medicine, because we're in the US, there's so many cultures here. So he said he just thought, well, curandero or curandera is the one who heals, so I'll just call it curanderismo. So it may have been coined by him in whatever 20 years ago, so the 90s, or maybe that's it's the early on.
The 90s were, I think, longer ago.
Early aughts, because my understanding, at least in Mexico, but I've heard from other people from other from Puerto Rico and Colombia, that there wasn't a name. People just like someone in La Señora que cura susto. There was just the person in the community who knew the hierbas, who knew how to do sobadas, or who was the partera. Then they didn't have a sign. They were just, again, it was a community took care of each other. And my Trudy, who's one of my maestras, and Trudy Robles, she said, and usually that person was very, very, very old. Elder, who just did this thing and that people knew just to go to. And so, the umbrella term curanderismo is maybe, kind of what we're using in modernity to just describe these practices that exist. And, also what I want to say about history, and this is true in Mexico, but I think throughout Latinx diaspora or America, is there's the root of the medicine that is indigenous to the land. That was Mexica or Yaqui or Otomi. That is also huge influence from African descendant people who were brought to these continents, enslaved, brought their practices, brought their herbs, brought their traditions. And some, like in Mexico, created their whole communities, the palenques, where they just practiced. But what I learned is that, the knowledge, how it got out into everyone else, it seeped into the broader umbrella of what we call it curanderismo. And then certainly the medicine and the beliefs and the iconography and the religion of the colonizers also became this, and added into the blend. And if you read Elena Avila, which you did, she calls it the three-headed serpent, And what I like to think is each of those serpents has multiple heads. Like, there's not homogeny in indigenous cultures in the Americas. Like, everyone's different, whether you're Zapotec or whatever, Navajo or Dene. And then in Africa, we're talking about West African, but there's also a lot of different tribes and practices. And even the medicine that comes from Europe, maybe primarily from Spain, comes from North Africa, comes from the Swana region, comes from all them. So I have this theory that curanderismo does have kind of a global appeal because it has so many roots. And even from that, the roots that aren't explicitly named are like what would come from, the Asian continents. But there's a really good book called Wind in the Blood, and it compares traditional Chinese medicine to Mayan medicine. And there's all these similarities. And then you'll hear stories of elders, from my elders. The people were traveling around the globe before the Europeans, quote, discovered. So there may have been a lot more cultural exchange going on, even like thousands of years ago. So that's just the broad term of curanderismo. I think it's very different, region to region, community to community, family to family, practitioner to practitioner. Like, there's not a homogenous way that it is. I mean, it's never been standardized. It's not like there's not a curriculum. And yet there's these practices that are common. And I'm meeting people, like I just met a friend from Colombia, and I'm just kind of blown away at the similarities to what I've from my Mexican maestras. So so I think within curanderismo there's a lot of permission for individual gifts, or the don, right? So mine is with plants, someone else maybe a therapist or whatever, to like express itself and to really like put as like a primary source of education as spirit or as earth, or as ancestors, or as plants. Like some of my teachers were trained in dreams by spirits, right? So it's not about the degree and the papers and all of that. It's an oral tradition, it's a folk tradition, and it's been passed on for generations. And certainly after the Spanish arrived and, colonized Mexico, like a lot of the knowledge went underground. A lot of it had to incorporate Catholicism to survive, because people were getting murdered, right? If you prayed to
the witch burning.
Yeah. And it happened in Europe. So again, when I started being called to these ways, like Elena Avila's book, when it came out, that was published in 1999. Again, 90s. That was before internet. Like it was really hard to find any information, any maestras. Like it really was not out there. And when I first started studying, I literally felt lonely, because I was like, anyone else who has this interest. And then the first community I met was in Sacramento at an organization called Soul Collective. And I met a community, primarily women, like a generation above me, who were kind of engaging in it and also helping host Enriqueta and Estela. But then what's happened in the last, 20 years, and then with social media is like an explosion, which in some ways is good, right? Because it brings so much more access and so much more visibility and so much more understanding that we also have traditional medicine. We have practices that we can use. And then, but then that layer of, along with social media, like it just brings, like, I think you said, that realm of the ego, the realm of, is someone doing this for the money or for the fame? And I know this, like I wrote about it in my book, like I think when I was a younger healer, of course my ego is involved. Like it felt good to help people, because guess what? They like you.
And that's human nature, right? That's human.
Yeah. Like we, and if we have whatever insecurities or lack of self-esteem, and to get liked, because I think a lot of mine had to do with being mixed race and super white passing and just wanting
I hear you on that one.
The Latinx community, right? So, but it wasn't conscious. But so right, our ego is going to be involved. But I don't even have an answer. But I just feel like, how you said, how can you distinguish? I think just if you're looking for a teacher, like talk to them, or talk to people who study with them, or just, how long have they been doing that? Like, what is their lineage? Like, I always name my lineage of Doña Enriqueta and Estela, and I've been doing it for this long. Someone, it may be their family lineage, and it maybe these times are calling for, Curanderas coming into their power in their 20s. Like, I don't know, but I think what I do know is to hold space for someone's healing process is a tremendous responsibility. And if we haven't done enough of our own work and know our own routine, our own aires, like that process can get really messy and harm can happen. And I know it's happened because I've heard of it, all the way from, minor harm to like people out there super misusing this title or this practice and sexually assaulting people. So it's all happening in our communities. So, I would say do your background check, talk to people, listen to your intuition, your gut, your instinct, like, because don't be so desperate for something that, and I feel like I did this, like we get attracted to someone who's a little sketchy, but they seem to have this like shiny carrot of like information. So we want it so badly, because I think, that's real too. So, and something I hope, and so I like your podcast, is that we actually just have conversations as a community. And again, that's something to look for. Like, is whoever your teacher, your master, are they part of a community, or are they like some wolf, like just on their own doing their thing? Like, who are they accountable? Who are their teachers? Who's keeping their issues in check? There's so many things, but I really believe, like I said before we got on, in the model of a community of practitioners, really supporting each other and saying like, Atava, like, well, of course I took time off when I was going through cancer, but some people don't, some people are still really sick and it's like, no, you need to take time off.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Great.
I'm always telling people in my community when I'm seeing them overworking themselves and recognizing how important their work is. I'm like, girl, are you resting? Are you taking care of yourself? Right.
Because who's benefiting from us burning out, right?
Yeah. I mean, and we have to check ourselves all the time. And we've been through those. I've been through that moment of burnout. And so I have to keep reminding myself as I came out of burnout was I can't show up for my community if I'm not whole, if I'm not showing up for myself. Right. And it's like a constant reminder because I think capitalism wants us to stay in the urgency of the moment and in the, like, we have to keep being hyper productive and
laboring for capitalism.
Yeah. So that's such an important thing, right? The wounded healer and the need for the healer to be able to also heal themselves, right? Or be in a community that can, heal each other.
This is such a timely conversation because I think, I just said reminder, but I think we both needed this reminder today. Like thinking of this year, I actually broke my tibia and fibula, my lower leg in January. And I've been really just thinking I need to, connect with community that's there, around that.
But
I've been doing all these other things.
Because when she broke her leg at the beginning of the year, her Virgo self.
I have a titanium rod. It was a surgery, right? Like
major surgery. And I felt like, I was like, okay, let's get, a food chain going. Let's let's call the chiropractor that we know, right? We have friends that do this work, that we are in a community of healers.
The susto, I need the limpia.
And she was so afraid to kind of reach out. I'm like, no, this is why this is why we're all here. This is what we're supposed to be doing. And I was like trying to remind you, like,
and I've been trying to go through insurance, to do the different things. And I'm just needed this. Very much so.
I always say, when I look around at the people that we've surrounded ourselves with, there's times where I've been, where we've all been together and I'm like, look at us. Like, look at us doing, doing this work. And like, this is the revolution right here. Right. Like, and cause we've got, parteras and doulas and, like all kinds of different healers who we have very personal relationships with and that we're in community with. And so I'm like, that's where the work is. And you're right. It's we always need to be reminded of that. Go ahead.
No, receiving is hard. I think I'll just say for myself, that's who I know best. You saying and having that like pattern. Yeah, for me, it took, again, before I had cancer, there was other things going on, but it really took that to be like, whoa, like it is actually time to receive and ask for help. And it still feels uncomfortable. Like I just passed my 5-year anniversary, and which in cancer world, they say you're cured. And I believe, I believe I was cured after, 5 years ago, but I asked for a prayer circle for myself because I'm dealing with a lot of long-term side effects of having a radical hysterectomy and really saw how minimized it was by Western medicine. They're like, oh, you'll be fine. Everything's okay. And that could be a whole nother conversation because it's like, oh, people with wombs, like you rip out all of that and they're just fine and sex is the same. Whatever. They just told me a lot of lies. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to ask for, I've been doing all these things on my own, but it's like, oh, it's time to ask for prayers to just like let people know I'm alive, what's going on, and to still tap into that community. But it still feels like, oh, I can't ask for this because so and so has this and it's a lot more serious, or what's going on in the world is so more serious. Like it's so hard, but I'm just it's actually my therapist. She's like, you're gonna do that.
Thank God for our
receive. Be a Curanderas for myself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, shout out to our therapist. I think, that is a certain level of healing, work that's
Yeah.
being done too. And yeah.
What's coming to mind as you were talking, and I want to share it, is the work that we do at the university, I guess, because we're trying to translate some of these things from a place of sharing from our healing too. I teach a class on witches. I got asked to teach it a long time ago. It was like maybe a few years after we met. And I realized it's a class on Curanderismo, integrating my my Mexican heritage and my Filipino heritage too, and then drawing from all these different other healers that I've studied under or worked with. And I was just thinking, I want to revamp. That's what I was thinking. I want to revamp the final paper to be, because I used to do this where they had to interview like someone in their family who continues to practice or pass down some cultural medicine, and that was so beautiful. But I got rid of that during COVID, and I'm going to bring it back as the final project, because I think that's where they're like, oh yeah, my abuela. Like, I'm like, yeah, she's still alive. Is your bisabuela still alive? Go talk to her, like, so, because that's beautiful. They can continue. The answer is not, again, I love this, outside of ourselves or some white savior, ish person, white male savior person. It's like, it's within us and within our families and our community,
That's why when I've been teaching this class on reproductive justice, and I kind of sandwich everything with like, we're going to start with what are ancestral ways that we've addressed, like reproductive care, and then like what happened during colonization and how, and the impact that colonization has had on that. And then coming back at the end, like, okay, then what are some holistic ways that we can approach reproductive care? And to me, all of that is what reproductive justice is. But I remember at the beginning kind of sharing like, oh, this is the way our ancestors, took care, and I'm teaching at a predominantly Latinx university, or at least people of color, right? Like I'm like, and and so when I say our ancestors, I mean, right, our ancestors prior to colonization and the way they practiced these things. And I mean, the amount of people who were looking at me like I was like, it was, they were learning about these things for the first time and had no sense that there was something outside of the, medical industrial complex and how, we
not give birth in a hospital. Like,
when I say that, when I'm like, oh, I had a home birth, they're like, what? And then, and again, a lot of this is like, all the information that I share is like, these are from people that I'm in community. We do have a friend who's a midwife. We have many friends who are doulas, right? We have friends who do womb care. Like, these are people in my community. And so, but I had a lot of students kind of being like, whoa, I didn't know that this existed. I didn't know, even because Cristina and I, actually, the first event we ever did together, we talked about the menstrual cycle in relation to like the moon cycle, and looking at not just from a physiological perspective around menstruation, but from an emotional perspective, like how do our emotions and how does our spirit sort of cycle, right, in these ways. And when I present that to my students, it's something that they haven't, we're taught about our periods from the perspective of like,
don't get pregnant.
Yes. Don't get pregnant, and 28-day cycle, and ovulation and fertility and all these things, but not really accounting for like, but what is actually happening, in our mind, body, spirit, what is happening in all those things. And so it's just it's a reminder when students are like hearing this for the first time that like, oh yeah, we don't really know this, or we're not really getting access to this. But what's beautiful is both of us took these classes given to us by these Western institutions.
This witch class was about like Harry Potter and, white witches, and I was like, bam, we're going to take that and we're going to talk about what that means for us. Cause, that's a good story, but we've got our stories, and I think the same, you're doing the same with your reproductive justice.
Yeah. And I think something I want to come back to, because, we can't have this conversation about Curanderismo and the history of it, and recognizing how its roots come from so many different cultures, without also having the conversation about cultural appropriation. And I think I'm curious because we've continuously having conversations, is about this and what does that mean? And I guess I'm curious for you is where is the line of cultural appropriation, or how are we?
That line sounds so binary,
I know.
doesn't it?
I'm going to change it. I'm going to shift it. Like, how can we be mindful of cultural appropriation as we are exploring our own journeys?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I also want to say it links to also imposter syndrome, maybe. I will mention that. So I'll say for myself, I have been blessed to have many teachers of many different backgrounds, not in my own ancestral background. And again, I came of age in the Bay Area where there was, master drummers from, West Africa coming, or, a Tibetan doctor, or, different northern native people, or curanderas, or people from Hawaii. I mean, really, I've had so many teachers. So I just like to, and I'm not perfect and whatever. I can't say I did it right, but I feel like there's a way to, I think they call it cultural appreciation. There's a way to learn from different people and different cultures in a way that just kind of activates our own inner knowing and our own knowledge. That, at least in my path, first of all, consent, right? If someone is sharing something with you, and or if you are in a space, are you there? Are you invited, right? So that's maybe 101, like what spaces are we invited? So I'm guessing if I'm invited to a space or in a space and people are sharing, I can use, that's very extractive, but I can absorb that medicine, those teachings for my own benefit and evolution, and hopefully also more understanding of this person, their culture, their background. And I just intuitively feel like there have been times since time immemorial that humans have been exchanging medicinal information. I mean, just the trade route of medicinal plants and spices has gone all around the world, because if something works, people travel. Like, I'm in land of Osha, but Osha is used by, tribes all across the quote US. So it was moving around. So exchange of information has always happened. And again, it's not a line, it's like a gray zone. It's like, what happens there? So, and this came up like, even with like my book and, sharing it with the world, like I say in the intro, like I am taking the lead from my teachers who really had open doors to whoever came into their classroom. Like they didn't say, no, you're not, Latinx, you can't be here. They're like, you're here. I mean, it's predominantly that, but they just taught everybody. And so that's because there's like another level, like this is healing information. We want people to heal. Why should we put a boundary? And it's like, then what do we do with that? Like, do we set up our shingle and we say we're a curandera? Like, but what did we do with that information? Or what I say explicitly in my book is, this inspires you, and this isn't your background, like dig deeper into your own roots, because you're going to find the same thing. Like the more I go into Polish medicine, the more it actually has a lot in common with Curanderismo. And I had this validated recently by a Slavic healer who's like, yeah, there's all these similarities. So there's, so that there's that level. And then there, and there's the sensitivity. Like one thing I did at my school, and this wasn't asked by my students, like I tried to have everybody who was teaching some cultural medicine to be of that background, because it's really normalized in the quote US. There's all acupuncturists. I don't know how many of them are Korean or Japanese or Chinese. I don't know. Say it's 25%. But so it's really normal for a non-Asian person to talk about acupuncture. But my students, they taught me like, no, like if we're that we're calling this Ancestral Apothecary, this name of my school, like we want I don't want to hear about my medicine from someone outside the culture. Yeah. Same with Ayurveda. So I was like, okay, that's the way to level up, to level up and say, yeah, you can maybe practice this medicine, but so I feel like I'm continuously learning, and also we have to be humble and hear feedback. We have to be careful what we do with the information that maybe has been shared with us. And if you don't know, ask. But then, like I do say, the other end of that is imposter syndrome. Because I can't tell you how many people who, even if it is our ancestry, don't feel like we have right to it.
Yeah.
And so, and then there's call out culture, which then layers on that too. So I just feel like we have to look at all those, because sometimes there's many reasons we don't feel like we have access, or we don't have the right to, and there's a lot of ways I bypass that. And I was like, you have the right to go outside and pray to the sun. The sun does not belong to any culture or any religion or any. Universally, praying to the sun is a spiritual practice, right? You have a right to grow your plants and to build a relationship with them. That is your birthright as a human being. You know, no one can say you can't do this or do that. So try to just bring it back to like what the earth, what the cosmos gives us free. And that's like, it can be an entry point, because like, oh, I don't speak Spanish, or I don't know Nahuatl, or, you know, I'm mixed or whatever, or, you know, like there's a zillion reasons like we can feel not, I mean, and I've gone through it too, but again, I feel like I was discovering this all at a time when there wasn't that kind of scrutiny. It's probably good, because if I was like 20 now, it probably be running the other way, because I'm like, I don't belong there, but I was just on a path before it was quote trending. So so I feel like those are all in the same conversation. We just have to be talking about, you know, aware of it. If we feel uncomfortable about something, or someone's teaching something, just ask questions, be in conversation. I mean, that's what I invite. It's like, let's have conversations. Let's not have like attacks. Like if someone missteps, which we do all the time, right? We can't.
I appreciate that conversation so much, and all those distinctions that you're making, you know, because I get asked that question too, like, well, what is cultural appropriation? And, you know, I always kind of use the example of, you know, when I was younger and I got sick, my mom would always make me drink tea with honey and lemon, right? Which I hated it when I was young. But obviously, as I've gotten older, I've been so much more appreciative of it, because it is medicine, right? And my mom is very much about, like, you know, different types of herbs for different types of ailment, you know, making teas for things. And I remember, and we know that so much of that medicine is seen as, what is it, like?
It's trivialized.
Yeah, it's like, oh, that's not real, right? That's just, you know, blah, blah, blah. And then I remember going to Whole Foods one time. And aside from seeing bundles of white sage, you know, also seeing tea, you know, with honey and lemon, like all these different herbal teas that, you know, kind of marketed themselves as these like holistic healing teas. And I was like,
Manzanita brand.
And I was like, what the fuck? Like, and I like, I got upset, and I think that, so when I talked about it with my students, I always talk about like, how are we aware of the power dynamics here, right? Where in that, you know, if, or even something like Day of the Dead, right? Where now Target sells
and resold.
Target sells like Day of the Dead things, but, you know, the money is going towards this big corporation, versus, you know, going to your local vendor that's going to be selling things, right? And I think about like just being aware of those power dynamics of who's benefiting from this and who has the potential to lose from this, right? Because if you can go to Whole Foods and buy it, or you can go to Target and buy it, then it does have, it's going to pull, you know, pull that sort of market away from the local vendors. Anyway, I just think that for me, it's about a power analysis, right? Like, what are the power dynamics in here, and does it have, the potential to be harmful? And but then also, I think definitely when you talk about imposter syndrome, I mean, I too, my ancestors are all from Mexico, but clearly, with my green eyes and light hair, have always had to navigate the complexity of how I present, and still figuring out like how I can still do the work I want to do in the world.
I'm glad to be doing this work with you. I love the cultural appreciation conversation. I do think for me, I think the power dynamics are really important. And I think there's something lost, when there's a practitioner that's not in their lineage or doesn't have this lineage, in the same way that, I could talk about yerba buena, like, just as it is, but if I have these stories with my abuela, I have this lineage, it feels there is spirit, in what I bring, because I have this ancestry, and so I appreciate that too. I also want to say, I feel like I came of age in the Bay Area in my early 30s. If that counts as coming of age, going to the California Institute of Integral Studies, even though it's pretty whitewashed, I was able to absorb and appreciate so much from my different teachers there. And then within San Francisco and the larger Bay Area too. I think that's where I found out about Ancestral Apothecary. Now.
And I think you're right, and we're right to call out culture, right? And and I think it's such a
call it in.
It's such a trick. I mean, all of the language is coded, in so many different things, and I think you're right to say, can we just have a conversation? Can we just be in conversation? Can we, do this from a place of community? Can we do this from a place of like understanding? And I think I think we're constantly navigating those things, because I mean, I was just telling Cristina, I was like, I think I have to get off social media for a little bit, because it's just too much when there are these moments, these global moments. It's just, I'm like, wow, people really just want to talk however they want to talk online. There's no, space for, meeting each other where we're at. And it's just really, really hard. And so, and anyway,
yeah, the anonymity that it allows, that kind of dehumanizing. We can talk about that a lot.
I always tell students, because I was recently on a panel, we were talking about the Barbie movie. And, everybody had all their different takes, on the Barbie movie, feminist perspectives and Black feminist perspectives and queer feminist perspectives, and, and all kind of good, bad, and otherwise. And somebody said, well, if we're, as a feminist collective, if we're not all on the same page, what does that mean? And I was like, why do we need to be all on the same page? Like, why is there this urgency for,
purity culture, right?
Purity culture. And I would just always go back to Ansaldúa we need to be comfortable with ambiguity, right? She says, like, we need to just kind of sit in the messiness of it. Like, that's where humanity lives. Like, we can't live in this or that or the right or wrong. It's like life is kind of messy, and we need to kind of be comfortable with messy. And I think it's, how can we try things and we step too much into cultural appropriation? Like, how can we come back, rather than saying you culturally appropriated, that's it, you're out, to say, oh, know what, you're right. How can I come back and be in right relationship with that, and allow for that humanity, while being aware of the power dynamics of those things and understand the complexity of it. So I love the conversation. And for me, I think for us, always the validation, like, we're thinking the same thing. We're on the right path. But I think, so I think we want to wrap up our convo. And to just maybe tell us a little bit about the book, and then where people can find it, where people can get it. I know people in our community are reading it and engaging with it. Look at that.
I know.
Yeah. And that, yeah, it's a beautifully designed book. So that'll just be the full title, The Curanderis Toolkit, Reclaiming Ancestral Latinx Plant Medicine and Rituals for Healing. And so this was first a class, and it's the class how I met Christy. It was first based in Oakland and then traveled around. And I was really, I don't know if I finished the story, is inspired to create a class centered on herbalism, but from this, from my, the perspective of, at least at that point, Mexican curanderismo, although it's the book, I really wanted to expand broader, into other cultures. But so yeah, it was a book. It was a class. And I had just amassed a lot of handouts and notes and really curriculum. And I always felt like I'd been talking for years that I want to write a book, but I was busy running a school. And actually, talk about endings and beginnings. It was very soon after my hysterectomy that I was literally approached by an editor who said, my editor of Heyday Books, I'm interested in the book you want to write. I was like, how'd you even know I'm writing the book? So I knew about my school, and it was at a herbal holiday fair where all my students were there. So this person just saw, they saw the community that I was co-created. So it has 13 chapters, and that's a sacred number in our tradition. And I also spotlight, and it's focused on plant medicine, but my critique again of the herbal community is plant medicine's often extracted from cultural context. Thus often created. We can at least say, like, I'm using ashwagandha, this is traditional in Ayurveda, or and this is how it's used there. But so I had to go out of my comfort zone to write this book, because I felt like I had to write a little bit about the history of, I really spent a lot of time thinking and writing about 1519 when Cortez and the Spanish came, and but also talking to again elders and trying to look at all the things that literally brought me to the point where I could be a young person interested and be accepted, loved, nourished by my elders in my community, right? Like some of my elders, if they talked about herbs or dreams, like they're like, no, you don't talk about that. It's brujeria, that's the devil, or else they're in academia and they got shunned. Like because it's still these times, we're blessed to just come into this at a point where it's, so I learned, so there's a chapter in history and how even like Chicano rights movement, American Indian movement, Black civil rights movement, all made, again, Northern California, Bay Area, Sacramento, like a generation of people who were like Elena Avila, who were remembering and returning. And so the door was opened by many of them. I also talk about, some cosmology, and I also needed guidance for that chapter, meaning from a lot of my experience as a danzante. So I had my maestra, Patricia Chicoy-Coat, just read that, because it's, again, I wanted to talk about, try to link the plants, at least in the same book, to like there's a cosmology, a way that, we could go into Mexican ancient history, like Mexica themselves brought, or I guess, occupied or brought many other tribes into their existence, right? Don't want to touch that, but just to say, I wanted to give it some cosmological context. And then talk about the plants. I tried to talk about, and the plants is really interesting. I'm actually teaching a class on November 4th. I could send you the link. It's open on Zoom, about like the history of plants in Mexico, because a lot of the ones we think about, yerba buena, ruda, manzanilla, those all actually came from Europe. So yes, I pay homage to them and write about them and how we use them, but it's like, what were the plants that were here before, like cempasúchil or pericon? So try to really try to find, if I could, some names. I focus mostly on Nahuatl, because of course there's many indigenous names for plants, because naming a plant has power. Like a lot of plants that are indigenous to Mexico get called Mexican sage, Mexican marigold, Mexican tarragon, which we could unpack that, right? So
yeah.
And then I think about limpias, self-baños, dreaming practices. And one of my favorite parts that I wanted to do, again, trying to really emphasize as a community, let's see, is to spotlight 13 different community curanderas. I don't know if you know Batul, True Heart, Mazo Medicina. So I interviewed 13 of my elders or comadres, students. Here's Bere, I think y'all know Bere. So that they each could tell their story in their voice. So really trying to convey that this is, again, a community, and that everyone has a different way to describe their practice or what it is, but you know, to have that. So that's the book.
Wow. I can't wait to, I mean, it's been a year, about a year that it's been out, right? But
yeah, it came out in July. Yeah, last year. Yeah.
Wow.
So it's a year and a half.
Integrate that into my course.
I know, of course.
Time.
Yeah. It's been really cool. Like a lot of folks are starting to include it into their college curriculum, which again, what I'm seeing now, which is really cool, is kind of like your generation infiltrating academia.
Yeah.
We're trying.
You could, like really, like because it's happening. Like and it's really cool because I think like whatever 20 years ago, I know that wasn't possible. Maybe in the quote women's studies or Chicano studies, but yeah. So it's available. I'd say don't buy it from Amazon. Ask your local independent bookstore.
Yeah.
But if you don't have access, bookshop.org is a good.
Yep.
We've
got a bookshop there.
Yeah, we'll put it on our
put it on our list and put the link in the
and my publisher is Heyday. You can buy it from heydaybooks.com.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm gonna actually email them and just try to make it work into the curriculum.
I know we can get a desk copy probably.
Yeah, and then like be able to get it and like just have that relationship too. That would be important.
It would go good in the bruja or
for
the witch
sure.
class.
Yeah,
for sure.
I even have a little page about brujeria and curanderismo and that whole complicated.
Oh yeah.
We
We love that conversation.
So
you know?
that would be a whole nother one because I basically said I respect whatever language people use to identify themselves because what I realized is some of my elders like bruja was really like offensive. And then the younger generations reclaiming it, and then there's all the history going back to what happened in Europe and continued in the Americas. So
taking all these things back, you know. And please do send us that link. This may come out a little later, but I want to take a photo of us. Actually, can we do that now? We'll just close out and then we'll share it. We'll make sure it gets out there.
We just want to say thank you so much for being on our podcast. We love this conversation. This is what this is our medicine, right? Is to be in conversation with those in our community, hoping that, so that this conversation then extends out and creates other conversations. And
you just brought so much to us, to people who are listening to our podcast. It's such an honor to have you with us.
So thank you. Mm-hmm.